27 specialists, 27 medical degrees from the finest Ivy League schools. 27 times Dante Kane had paid a king's ransom to keep his infant son, Zoe, from fading away, and 27 times they had treated his heir like a broken machine instead of a human being. So Dante did what the head of the Kane syndicate does best. He retreated behind his bulletproof glass, turned on his 4K surveillance monitors, and watched. He watched every breath, every milliliter of formula, and every heartbeat from a marble desk that had signed more death warrants than birth certificates. Returning to the nursery, Dante found Ava sitting in a rocking chair, holding Zoe skin to skin. The baby's breathing, usually labored and wheezing, was rhythmic for the first time in weeks. "The agency said you were just a maid," Dante said, standing in the shadows. "And they said you were a king," Ava replied, not looking up. "But a king who can't feed his own son without a taster isn't much of a ruler, is he?" The room went silent. Dante looked at the scarred hands that had built an empire, then at the tiny, fragile hand of his son, gripping Ava's finger. "The formula stays in the trash," Dante commanded. "From now on, you prepare everything. You don't leave this room. I'll provide the security." "I don't need your security, Mr. Kane," Ava said, finally meeting his gaze with a look of pure steel. "I need you to be a father. I can stop the poison, but only you can stop the people sending it." Dante walked to the window, looking out at the city he supposedly controlled. He'd built his world on fear, but today he realized fear wasn't enough to protect a nursery. He turned back to her, the hitman's coldness in his eyes replaced by something much more dangerous, a father's resolve. "Keep him alive, Ava," he whispered. "I'll handle the family reunion." The heavy oak doors of the nursery didn't just close, they sealed like a tomb. Dante Kane stood in the dimly lit hallway of his penthouse, the rhythmic, mechanical wheezing of his son's ventilator echoing in his mind. Behind him, the 27th nurse, a woman with 3 degrees and a trembling lower lip, scrambled to gather her things. "Mr. Kane, the levels are fluctuating because of the humidity, not the care." "Get out," Dante said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You spent 4 hours staring at the monitor and not once did you touch his hand. You're not a nurse. You're an observer. I have cameras for that." As his security team escorted the sobbing woman toward the private elevator, Dante turned his gaze to the monitors lining the wall of his corridor. He saw Zoe, pale, fragile, a tiny heartbeat struggling against a world that was already trying to snuff him out. Dante's tattooed fingers traced the jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a reminder of a night in Marseille where he'd survived an ambush. He could survive a war, but he was losing to a common nursery. "The next one is waiting in the library, boss," Marco, his head of security, whispered. "Ava, no agency backing, just a list of private references from difficult places." Dante adjusted his cufflinks and walked toward the library. He expected another specialist who would bow their head, avoid his eyes, and stammer through a resume. When he pushed the doors open, he found a woman standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline. She didn't turn around immediately. She was dressed in a simple, charcoal gray uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot. "You're late," she said, her voice steady and carrying a faint melodic accent that Dante couldn't quite place. Dante stepped into the light, letting the shadows fall away from the violent map of his face. He leaned against his marble desk, his presence designed to intimidate, to break the will of anyone seeking entry into his inner sanctum. "I own the clock in this house. You're Ava?" She turned then. She didn't gasp, her eyes didn't dart to the scar or the ink-stained skin of his hands. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye with a clinical, almost weary intensity. It was the look of someone who had seen blood on the floor and didn't find it particularly interesting. "I am," she replied, walking toward him. She stopped just 2 feet away, well within his personal space, a zone where most men feared to breathe. I've read the reports. You fired 27 people because you're looking for a miracle. I don't deal in miracles, Mr. Kane. I deal with reality. And the reality is your son is being suffocated by your fear. Marco moved forward, his hand hovering near his jacket, but Dante raised a hand to stop him. He leaned in closer, his voice a low growl. You know who I am, what I do. I know you're a man who thinks he can buy life the way he buys loyalty. I don't care about your syndicate. I care about the boy. If you want someone to tremble when you walk in the room, hire a bodyguard. If you want your son to take a breath without a machine, let me work. Dante studied her. She was the first person in a month who hadn't looked at him like a monster, but rather like he was a distraction.
Start tonight, Dante said. But know this, Ava. If you fail him, there isn't a corner of this earth where I won't find you. Then we understand each other, she said, already turning toward the door. Because if I fail him, I'll be looking for myself, too. The stillness of the penthouse was deceptive. While the rest of Seoul glittered with chaotic life below, Dante Kane's private sanctuary remained a silent, pressurized vault of glass and steel. He sat in his office, the only light emanating from a wall of high-definition monitors that flickered with the blue-white glow of the nursery. This was his glass cage, a vantage point that allowed him to be everywhere and nowhere, watching the heartbeat of his empire and the failing lungs of his son simultaneously. On the center screen, Ava moved with a fluid, unhurried grace that felt foreign to the room's sterile atmosphere. The specialized medical protocol Dante had spent millions to establish was clear: hourly vitals, strict posture adjustments, and minimal physical contact to reduce the risk of infection. The previous 27 nurses had followed these rules with the mechanical precision of soldiers facing a firing squad. Ava, however, was already breaking them. Dante leaned forward, his hands clasping into a tight knot on the marble desk. He watched as she bypassed the digital chart and reached into the crib. Instead of checking the IV site first, she slid her arms beneath Zoe, lifting the fragile infant against her chest. Dante's pulse quickened. His finger hovered over the intercom button, ready to roar a reminder about the oxygen stabilization protocols, but he hesitated. She wasn't checking a clock. She was listening. She tucked Zoe's small head into the crook of her neck, ignoring the tangle of sensors that trailed behind them like umbilical cords of copper and silicone. Then the audio feed picked up a sound that didn't belong in a house built on silence. It was a low, rhythmic hum, a vibration more than a melody. Ava began to sway, a slow, grounded movement that seemed to synchronize with the hum. It was an old folk song, the lyrics melodic and strange, rising from her throat in a language that felt like warm earth and ancient dust. It was a stark contrast to the cold ozone smell of the server room where Dante sat. "She's deviating from the schedule, boss," Marco's voice crackled over the radio, tinted with his usual clinical suspicion. "Should I go in?" "Wait," Dante commanded, his eyes fixed on the screen. On the monitor, something impossible happened. The jagged, frantic lines of Zoe's heart rate monitor, the ones that had kept Dante awake for months with their erratic spikes, began to smooth out. The red warning light on the pulse oximeter, which usually blinked with the threat of falling oxygen, went dark. The machine acknowledged a stability it hadn't recorded in weeks. Zoe's tiny, translucent hand, which usually balled into a fist of distress, relaxed, his fingers splaying open against Ava's charcoal uniform. Dante watched, mesmerized and frustrated. He had built a fortress of technology to save his son, yet this woman was bypassing his entire defense system with a song and a heartbeat. She wasn't just ignoring his rules, she was proving they were the wrong rules. As she sang, Ava turned slightly. Her gaze drifted toward the hidden camera in the teddy bear's eye. She didn't stop singing, but her expression shifted, a fleeting, knowing look that pierced through the 4K resolution and hit Dante right in his chest. It was the look of a woman who knew she was being watched and simply didn't care. She continued to rock the air to the Kane Syndicate, treating the most dangerous man in the city like a ghost in his own home. The clock on Dante's office wall chimed midnight. But in the nursery, time was measured by the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Ava stood at the sterile prep station, the soft light of the under-cabinet LEDs reflecting in the stainless steel surfaces. Through the monitor, Dante watched her reach for the premium gold-labeled canister of formula. It was a custom blend, fortified with rare nutrients, delivered every 48 hours under armed escort from the Kane family's private laboratory. It was the only thing his sister Alina insisted on managing herself, claiming it was the liquid life that would save the Kane bloodline. Ava moved with her usual economy of motion, measured and calm. She leveled a scoop of the pale powder into a glass bottle and added the distilled water. But as she began to swirl the mixture, her hands that had stitched wounds in dust-choked clinics, suddenly went still. Dante leaned into his desk, his eyes narrowing. On the screen, Ava didn't finish the preparation. She didn't snap the nipple onto the bottle. Instead, she brought the open neck of the glass toward her face. She took a shallow breath, then another, deeper one. Her shoulders tensed, a visible ripple of alarm passing through her frame. She poured a small amount of the liquid into the palm of her hand and brought it to her nose. In the high-definition feed, Dante could see her pupils dilate. She didn't taste it, she knew better. She stood frozen for a 5-second count. Her gaze darted toward the crib where Zoe lay sleeping, then back to the bottle in her hand. A cold, familiar dread began to coil in Dante's gut. It was the same feeling he got before a betrayal, the prickle at the base of his neck before a bullet left a barrel. He saw Ava set the bottle down with a hand that trembled slightly, though her face remained a mask of iron. She didn't reach for the sink to dump it. Instead, she took a clean cloth, wiped her palm clinically intensely, then reached for the silver-plated canister the powder had come from. She leaned over it, her hair falling forward as she took a long, deliberate inhale of the dry powder. When she straightened up, the look on her face wasn't one of confusion. It was the look of a woman who had just found a snake in a cradle. In his office, Dante's hand clamped onto the arm of his chair so hard the leather groaned. He knew that look. He knew that if she had smelled what he suspected, the faint, sickly sweet scent of bitter almonds, it meant the formula wasn't fortified, it was laced. On the screen, Ava did the unthinkable. She looked directly into the teddy bear's eye, her expression stripped of its usual weariness. She held the bottle up to the camera lens, her voice a low, dangerous rasp that cut through the silence of the surveillance room. "You're watching the perimeter for soldiers, Mr. Kane," she whispered, her eyes burning into the camera. "But someone is already inside. This isn't medicine, it's a funeral in a bottle." She turned and poured the liquid into a nearby potted orchid, the white milk soaking into the soil like a slow-acting curse. Dante stood, his chair skidding back against the marble floor. He didn't wait for Marco. He didn't check the vitals. He moved toward the door, his mind a blur of tattooed fury and the sudden, terrifying realization that his son wasn't dying of a disease, he was being executed. The silence in the nursery was absolute, save for the mechanical click of the ventilator that sounded increasingly like a countdown. Ava didn't move from the prep station. She stood with her back to the crib, her gaze fixed on the plush, stitched face of a teddy bear perched on a high shelf. Most people saw a toy. She saw the unnatural glimmer of a wide-angle lens buried in its glass eye. She held the empty bottle in one hand and the gold-labeled canister in the other, her knuckles white. She didn't look like a maid anymore. She looked like a whistleblower in a lion's den. "I know you can hear the heartbeat monitor from your desk, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register that vibrated through the high-frequency microphones hidden in the crown molding. "I know you're sitting there, tracing your scars and wondering if I'm the one who finally brought the blade into your house." She stepped closer to the teddy bear, her face filling the frame of Dante's monitors. Her eyes were hard, devoid of the flattery or terror he was accustomed to. She wasn't begging for her life, she was demanding his attention. "You've built a fortress out of glass and steel. You watch the gates, the elevators, and the shadows in the garden, but you've let the poison walk through the front door because it wore a familiar face. You're sitting in that chair, playing God with a joystick, while your son is being systematically erased by the only people you were taught to trust. She held up the canister, tilting it so the gold leaf caught the light. Every scoop of this is a handful of dirt on his grave. It's elegant. It's professional. It mimics the very respiratory failure you're so afraid of. If I hadn't spent 3 years in a ward where the water was more toxic than the waste, I might have missed it too. But I've smelled this shadow before. Ava leaned in until her lips were inches from the hidden lens. The defiance in her expression was a physical weight, a challenge thrown across the digital divide. "Stop being a spectator to your own tragedy," she hissed. "The time of watching is over. If you want to see the person who is actually killing your son, stop looking at me and come down here. Look at this bottle. Look at the seal. Then look at the guest list for your last family dinner." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned her back on the camera, walked over to Zoe's crib, and placed her hand over the small, struggling chest. It was a gesture of shield-like protection. In the office, the feed remained live, showing the still, tense tableau of the nursery. Dante's hand was already on the heavy brass handle of his door. The transition from the cold, calculated observer to the lethal, protective father was instantaneous. He didn't need to see more. The teddy bear eye had revealed a truth more terrifying than any rival syndicate. His house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and the maid was the only one holding the evidence. The heavy elevator doors hadn't fully retracted before Dante Kane was through them, his boots striking the polished floor with the weight of a death sentence. Behind him, the corridor was a blur of motion as his security details struggled to keep pace, but Dante was a man possessed by a singular cold clarity. He didn't feel the weight of the Glock 17 in his hand. He only felt the phantom scent of bitter almonds and the image of Ava's defiant eyes on the monitor. 30 seconds. That was the time it took to descend from his glass fortress to the nursery. In that half minute, his world had shifted from a medical mystery to a tactical theater. He kicked the double doors open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile room. He entered with the weapon raised, the muzzle sweeping the corners of the room out of sheer, conditioned instinct. He was looking for an assassin, a ghost, a traitor hiding behind the curtains. But the only person there was Ava. She didn't flinch at the sight of the gun. She didn't scream or drop to her knees. She remained standing by the prep station, bathed in the soft, blue glow of the vitals monitor. In her hand, she held the glass bottle like a holy relic, or perhaps a detonator. Her thumb was pressed firmly over the nipple, sealing the contents inside. "Where is he?" Dante roared, his voice thick with a rage that threatened to shatter the very glass that protected his son. "He is right where you left him, Mr. Kane," Ava said, her voice a jarring contrast of calm against his turbulence. She didn't look at the weapon pointed at her chest. She looked at him. "And he is safer now than he has been in weeks, because for the first time, the poison has stopped flowing." Dante lowered the weapon slightly, his chest heaving. He crossed the distance between them in 3 predatory strides, the scent of leather and expensive cologne clashing with the antiseptic air. He reached out, his tattooed fingers closing around the neck of the bottle she held. He didn't pull it away, he simply held it with her, staring down at the pale, frothy liquid. "You're sure?" he whispered, the words sounding like a prayer and a curse. "Smell it for yourself," she challenged, her hand steady beneath his. The chemical profile of a Kane Syndicate fortification isn't supposed to include cyanide derivatives. Someone didn't just want him sick, Dante. They wanted him to stop breathing while you watched, making sure you'd blame the doctors, the nurses, and finally, yourself. Dante took the bottle, bringing it to his face. The scent was faint, masked by the creamy aroma of the formula, but it was there, a sharp metallic edge that made his blood run cold. His gaze drifted to Zoe, who was sleeping with a peace that seemed impossible given the violence currently vibrating through the room. He looked back at Ava. For the first time, he didn't see a maid or a subordinate. He saw the only person in his entire empire who wasn't afraid to tell him his throne was built on a graveyard. "Marco," Dante shouted without turning his head. The security chief appeared in the doorway, breathless. Seal the kitchen. I want the laboratory team in the basement in 5 minutes. And find my sister. Tell her there's a problem with the delivery." He turned the gun over in his hand, clicking the safety back on with a chilling finality. "Ava," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal silk. "Don't leave his side. If anyone else touches that door, anyone, you have my permission to end them." The basement of the Kane estate didn't house wine or dusty memories. It housed the syndicate's private forensic laboratory, a sterile underworld of centrifuges and white-coated men who specialized in the chemistry of death. Dante entered the lab like a thunderstorm, the glass bottle gripped in his hand. Following behind him, Ava looked out of place in her charcoal uniform, yet her presence was the only thing keeping Dante from burning the room to the ground. "Analyze this," Dante commanded, slamming the bottle onto a vibration-dampened workbench. Dr. Aris, a man whose loyalty had been bought and paid for over 2 decades, blinked behind his spectacles. He looked at the gold-labeled formula, then at the manic glint in his employer's eyes. "Sir, this is the specialized blend from your sister's lab. We've already run the baseline safety tests on the initial batch." "I didn't ask for a history lesson." Dante's voice was a low, vibrating growl that made the glass beakers on the shelves rattle. "Now." Aris moved with frantic precision. He took a sample of the liquid, pipetting it into a mass spectrometer. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the machinery. Dante stood motionless, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor, while Ava leaned against the cold metal cabinet, her arms crossed, watching the screen with the grim patience of a prophet waiting for the inevitable. The machine whirred, processed, and finally emitted a sharp, clinical beep. A graph appeared on the monitor, a jagged mountain range of chemical signatures. Aris leaned in, his face turning the color of ash. He tapped a few keys, zooming in on a specific peak in the data. "Well?" Dante demanded. It's a synthetic neurotoxin, but it's been modified. It's been bound to the fat molecules in the milk so that it doesn't trigger an immediate reaction. It's designed to accumulate in the lung tissue over weeks, slowly paralyzing the diaphragm, which would look exactly like a natural respiratory failure in an infant. Dante stared at the screen. The betrayal wasn't just a concept anymore. It was a digital readout. It was a mathematical certainty. And the source? Aris swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "The molecular signature matches the stabilizers used exclusively in the Kane family pharmaceutical wing. This wasn't an outside contamination, Mr. Kane. This was synthesized at the source. It's part of the formula itself." The air in the lab seemed to vanish. Dante's hand went to the edge of the workbench, his grip so powerful the metal began to groan. He thought of Elena, his sister, the woman who had sat by Zoe's crib and wept for his sickness, the woman who had hand-delivered these canisters with a smile of false comfort. He didn't roar. He didn't break anything. The rage was too deep for that now. It had turned into a cold, crystalline resolve. He looked at Ava, who was watching him with a mixture of pity and validation. "You were right," Dante said, the words sounding like dry leaves crushing underfoot. "Being right doesn't save the boy," Ava replied softly. "Only the truth does." Dante turned to Marco, who was waiting by the door. "Bring my sister to the holding room. Do not let her speak to anyone. And Marco," Dante's eyes were like 2 voids of black ink, "bring the remaining canisters. I want her to finish the last one herself." The holding room was a cold, windowless space that smelled of ozone and damp concrete. But as Dante leaned against the metal door, his mind was miles away, anchored in a memory that now felt like a fever dream. It was only 2 weeks ago, Sunday dinner at the estate. The long mahogany table had been laden with a traditional Kane family feast, a spread of opulence meant to signal strength, but all Dante could see was the ghost of his son's labored breathing. His sister, Elena, had reached across the table, her hand soft as she placed it over his tattooed knuckles. Her eyes were shimmering with a curated grief. "You look exhausted, Dante," she had murmured, her voice a soothing velvet.
The doctors are useless. They don't understand the Kane Constitution. You need to trust the family's legacy, not these outsiders." He remembered how his brother, Victor, had nodded solemnly from the head of the table, sipping a vintage red as if he wasn't currently planning the expansion of the pharmaceutical wing into the syndicate's primary power base. "We've spent millions on the new fortification, Dante," Victor had added, his tone thick with a brother's supposed concern. "The lab finished the latest batch of vitamins this morning. It's the highest concentration of nutrients we've ever produced. It will give Zoe the strength to fight the infection." The memory played back in agonizingly sharp detail. Elena reaching into her designer bag and pulling out a small amber vial. It looked like gold in the candlelight. She had pressed it into Dante's palm with a squeeze that he had mistaken for love. "Promise me you'll give him the first dose tonight," she had whispered. "I personally supervised the bottling. I wouldn't trust anyone else with our heir's life." Dante had looked at that vial, his eyes stinging with a rare vulnerability. He had thanked her. He had called her the only person he could rely on in a world of enemies. He kissed her cheek, unaware that he was kissing the lips of a Judas who had just handed him the nails for his son's coffin. Beside him, in the present, Ava stood silently, her presence a grounded reality that shattered the hazy deception of the past. She watched the way his jaw worked, the way his hands shook with the effort of not striking the wall. She didn't need to ask what he was thinking. The vitamins had never been meant to heal. They were the slow-acting, silent hitmen, hand-delivered by a woman who probably practiced her morning face in the mirror before coming to dinner. "They sat at my table," Dante whispered, the sounds like the cracking of frozen earth.
Sleep tight, my baby.
They
Safe
toasted to
and
his
sound.
health while they measured the toxin.
Move in! Go, 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 go!
Betrayal never comes from your enemies, Mr. Kane. If it did, it wouldn't be called betrayal. It would just be war. Dante straightened, the grief in his eyes hardening into a black, obsidian-like resolve. The memory of the family table faded, replaced by the image of the holding room door. Behind it sat Elena, likely still wearing the same mask of sisterly devotion. But the man opening the door was no longer the mourning father she could manipulate. He was the king, and the time for grace had expired. The transition from the basement to the office was silent, but it felt like the quiet before a tectonic shift. Dante Kane sat behind his marble desk, the weight of his tattooed hands pressing flat against the cold stone. Behind him, the wall of monitors no longer showed the sterile peace of the nursery. Instead, they displayed a grid of high-definition betrayal. On screen 4, his brother Victor was in the billiards room, casually chalking a cue, unaware that his life was now measured in seconds. On screen 7, Elena sat in the garden room, a glass of white wine in her hand, the same hands that pressed the vial of neural toxin into Dante's palm. She looked serene, a woman waiting for a phone call that would tell her she was now the guardian of a vast, leaderless empire. Dante's eyes were bloodshot, two dark pits of focus. Beside him, Ava stood like a shadow. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to. She was the witness who had pulled the veil back, and now she was the only person in the world who could look at him without a mask. He reached out and touched the screen where Elena sat. He traced the line of her throat, the throat that had whispered lies of sisterly love while his son's lungs were collapsing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent a lifetime protecting his bloodline from the outside world, only to find the rot was at the very heart of the tree. "You have the laboratory results," Dante said, his voice a low, terrifying silk that vibrated in the small room. "I do, boss," Marco replied from the shadows by the door. His voice was thick with the grim realization of what was coming. In the Kane syndicate, family wasn't just a bond, it was the law, and the penalty for breaking that law was absolute.
"They use the boy as a pawn," Dante whispered, more to himself than to the room. "They didn't just want my chair. They wanted to watch me bury the only thing I ever loved. They wanted to see me broken so they could step over my corpse." He looked at Ava. "Is he sleeping?" "He is," she said softly. "His oxygen levels are holding. The air is clean now." Dante nodded slowly. A flicker of something ancient and ruthless settled in his gaze. He reached for the intercom on his desk, his thumb hovering over the button that connected him to every tactical team stationed throughout the estate. He looked at Victor on the screen. He looked at Elena. "Marco," Dante said, his voice devoid of any human emotion. It was the sound of a machine finishing a calculation. "Clear the house." The order was simple. It was final. It was the hit on the bloodline. "Every room?" Marco asked, his hand already on his radio. "Every room," Dante confirmed. "No survivors. If they carry the Kane name and they aren't in this office or the nursery, they are the enemy. Purge the infection. Now." He watched the monitors. He didn't turn away. He watched as the tactical teams, dressed in black and moving like ghosts, entered the billiard room. He watched as Elena's glass of wine shattered on the marble floor. He didn't blink. He sat at his desk, the king of a shrinking kingdom, watching the fire he had started consume the family that had dared to poison his son. Beside him, Ava placed a hand on his shoulder, not in comfort, but in a silent pact. The nursery was safe, but the world outside it was about to burn. The silence that followed the storm was heavier than the violence itself. The gunshots had been muffled by the thick, soundproofed walls of the estate, sounding to Dante like nothing more than distant, rhythmic heartbeats. On the monitors, the tactical teams moved through the rooms like shadows cleaning a slate. The garden room was empty. The billiards room was still. The infection had been excised with surgical, bloody precision. Dante sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the screen showing the nursery. He watched as Ava leaned over Zoe's crib, her hands resting gently on the infant's forehead. She didn't look at the cameras anymore. She didn't need to. The man behind the lens was no longer a stranger she had to provoke. He was a man who had just destroyed his world to save a single life. He stood and walked down the long, hollow corridor. The scent of gunpowder and expensive floor wax hung in the air. But as he pushed open the nursery doors, it was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of eucalyptus and fresh air. The ventilator was still clicking, but the sound was no longer a countdown. It was a metronome. Dante approached the crib, his movements slow, his presence no longer predatory. He looked down at Zoe. The gray, translucent tint of the boy's skin had been replaced by a faint, healthy flush. For the first time in months, the infant's chest rose and fell with a deep, unburdened rhythm. "His fever broke 10 minutes ago," Ava whispered, not looking up. "The toxins are clearing. His body is finally fighting for itself instead of fighting the medicine." Dante reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering over the crib, before he finally let his finger touch Zoe's tiny palm. The boy's hand instinctively curled around Dante's knuckle, a grip that felt stronger than any oath of loyalty Dante had ever received. A single hot tear tracked through the jagged scar on Dante's face, but his expression remained a mask of iron. He looked at Ava. She was exhausted, her charcoal uniform wrinkled and stained, her eyes heavy with the weight of the last 24 hours. She had no stake in his empire. She had no claim to his name. She had walked into a den of monsters and dared to speak the truth when everyone else was paid to lie. "You're staying," Dante said. It wasn't a command, but a realization. Ava finally met his gaze. She saw the wreckage of a man who had just killed his own blood, and she saw the father who would have burned the world for the child between them. "I'm staying," she agreed softly, "but not for the syndicate, Dante, and not for the money." "I know," he replied. In a world built on surveillance, encrypted ledgers, and blood oaths, Dante Kane had spent his life searching for someone he could trust. He had looked among his soldiers, his advisors, and his own siblings, only to find that loyalty was a currency that could always be devalued. He looked at the maid, the woman who had nothing and risked everything, and he realized the search was over. In the wreckage of his family, she was the only truth left standing. The king had found his only ally, and for the first time in 37 years, the glass cage felt like a home.